I have been getting tagged in so many messages asking if Quantum Riddler is the truth, if it's the best thing that you could be doing in your Dimir Murktide shell. And I'm here to tell you the answer is maybe. Now, I know that intro didn't really give you a lot of information, but don't worry, we've got a lot to cover in this video. So before I get started, I just want to let you know ahead of time, this is not going to be a gameplay video. It's going to be more of a podcast style discussion. I'm going to be talking about all of my thoughts and experience and future direction involving the card Quantum Riddler. So as you know, if you are looking for gameplay, we have a plethora of leagues already up on YouTube with different configurations, different test ideas. We've got more live streams with more test ideas coming out pretty soon. So you're not going to miss out on any action. But for this video, I really wanted to break into my initial thoughts involving Riddler. I wanted to go over the good, what's been positive for the deck, what matchups I've liked it for, what kind of build of the deck I've enjoyed playing Riddler in. I want to look at the bad, what it hasn't been good at, what kind of role the card ultimately fills in the 75 if you choose to run it. And then last, we're going to go through some matchups with the Riddler list. So the Riddler list does sideboard fairly differently from your stock Murktide or Oculus list. So I want to make sure we attack a few of the more popular decks in the current modern meta and really go into some specific examples of how this deck sideboards against those. So you'll have a little better understanding at the end of this video of exactly what Quantum Riddler is bringing to the table and how you can best utilize that or know what you're giving up if you choose to, so that you can have the best chance of winning some matches of Magic going forward. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the role of Riddler and the good. So to kick us off, let's sort of give a breakdown of the role that Quantum Riddler fills. If there's anything that you take away from this video, I really hope it's this. Quantum Riddler is not a replacement for Murktide Regent. It's an alternative to Murktide Regent. So we've traditionally seen meta games where aggressive decks kind of rotate into favor with Boros Energy and Izzet Prowess. And the Oculus shells really came to rise to power, being able to get out on the board a little more early, a little more consistently, clog the ground up, a little recursion with our unearths. And Oculus found a lot of success in those sort of fast-paced, creature-based metagames. And we've seen Murktide really do the same when things have gone a little more combo-centric, when the advantage of playing better cantrips like Preordain over Thought Scour, when hard casting your threat is 2 mana instead of 3 mana, making it easier to hold up that Spell Snare or that Thought Seize, that crucial piece of interaction. Murktide really shines in those spots. So being better into a lot of the combo matchups like Belcher, like Neobrand, like Storm. So where does Riddler fit into this puzzle? And effectively, it's Riddler is the mid-range killer. The mid-range killer slash kind of sharing the spotlight with Murktide into some of the control matchups. So Quantum Riddler has this unique floor of if you warp it out or you hard cast it, you're always going to replace itself with another card. Sometimes it's 2 cards. At the very least, you're going to have a new piece of hardware in hand. The reason this is unique to this card, and we haven't really had access to it before, is we're in a meta game where cards like Solitude are very popular out of the Blink shells. It's very easy for opponents to 1-for-1 answer Murktides or Oculus with Static Prison, with Solitude, with effects like that. Leyline Binding we're seeing a lot of right now. So investing your graveyard and some mana into a Murktide and have it get dealt with fairly effectively is a big ask for the deck to overcome. But Quantum Riddler allows you to play out your threat, draw a card early, replace itself, and kind of stash that threat away in exile. And then when you get later on in the game, you're able to control the board a little bit more. You find a safe spot. You can hard cast that Quantum Riddler back out, hopefully draw 2, and really run away with the card advantage game. But if not, have a decent sized flying, aggressively slanted threat, good power, good toughness. So that's kind of the ideal slot for Riddler. Is it just fits part of this trifecta with Murktide and Oculus. So you've got Murktide into the control matchups, Oculus into the aggro, Quantum Riddler a little bit more into the mid-range / control. And that's where I think the card really shines and really carves out a spot for itself as something to do besides Murktide. Obviously, being able to dodge a lot of the grave hate that's running around, Thraben Charms, Territorial Kavus, some Endurances, not as much as we've seen, Boggart Trawlers, stuff like that. Being able to dodge those cards is a really big advantage, but I don't think it's the key reason to be looking at Quantum Riddler as a potential card to run. So now that we've got an idea of what Quantum Riddler does different than Murktide and Oculus, let's get a little bit more into the good matchup. Let's talk about where the card, I think, really shines. So the best matchup, I think, for Quantum Riddler in the current metagame, or the one that I've had the most impressive showings of the card for, has been against Blink. The blue, black, white variations, or we've seen these more Esper controlling style lists showing up, but even just straight Orzhov Blink, Quantum Riddler has been fantastic into. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. First off, you know that at its floor, it's going to be replace itself. So if you're able to warp out a Riddler, draw a card, stash away that Riddler, that's already doing you a good favor of getting to keep access to that threat while replacing it with something new, something effective. You also have the advantage of attacking the Quantum Riddler text in a different capacity. When you think about these Blink decks, you really think about their ability to utilize Quantum Riddler as well. So you think, if I got an upgrade for Quantum Riddler, they got an upgrade for Quantum Riddler, surely we're not getting the same effect out of the card. Otherwise, they're still just going to stay ahead of us, right? They were already favored pretty heavily in the matchup. If we both get Quantum Riddler, they just stay up there. And I don't think that's the case. And it's because we've got multiple different paragraphs on this card to look at. I think that the Blink deck with Ephemerate is very, very good at really taking advantage of the ETB trigger on Quantum Riddler to draw a card, which is obviously pretty cool, pretty effective out of them to warp out Riddler on turn 3 or attack, like flash in Ophelia, untap, play a Riddler, attack. But warp it out, blink it, draw a card, keep the 4/6 round next turn, maybe blink it again, draw a card. But we're really good at taking advantage of Quantum Riddler's static ability, which is as long as we have one or fewer cards in hand, if we would draw a card, instead we draw that many +1. So if you go to your draw step and you have one card in hand, you draw 2, draw up to 3. But for our deck, this takes the form of quite a few possibilities. So we've got Preordain, scry 2, draw 2. We've got Cameo Clues, pay 2 mana, draw 2 cards. Psychic Frog, hit you, draw 2. Cling to Dust, exile something, draw 2. Kaito, 0 the Kaito, surveil 2, draw 2. Second Riddler ETB, they stack. If you have multiple Riddlers and have one on the battlefield, warp a second one card in hand, then you draw the full 3. You draw 1, an extra for the first Riddler, extra for the second Riddler. It's really, really useful for getting back into games. So in these matchups like Blink, where they've notoriously been taking advantage of Overlord of the Baelmerk being draw a card, or blinking an Overlord be draw a card. Now Riddler draw a card. A lot of times we're getting draw 2, and that keeps us ahead pretty consistently into some of those matchups. And it's a really cool feeling when you can combine it with the fact that Thoughtseize and Subtlety, some of these free interactive spells, can be aggressively played out, knowing that we're going to have Riddler to refill our hand. And if we warp the Riddler early, it can't be Thoughtseized. It's tucked away safely. You can get access to it when the game goes longer. Now, I do understand part of this is also the fact that we've got more main deck Kaitos and Tamios and Subtleties. It's not quite the same Blue-Black X mid-range deck, but Quantum Riddler itself has done more than carry its weight to show an impressive amount of versatility in that matchup specifically. Now, once you get past the Blink matchup, there are a few others that it shines. For example, the mirror matches, when you know you're going to get down to a top deck war, more than likely, if you're able to Thoughtseize away an early Kaito or keep some creatures off the board, then Quantum Riddler's ability to draw those extra cards as the game goes on is phenomenal, especially if you're like right now where a lot of players are cutting counter spells, going up on forces and subtleties, ways that don't actually permanently deal with the Quantum Riddler. Then the ability to play it out, have it subtletied, replay it again, have it subtletied again, replay it again, and know that you're still going to win that exchange is a really, really nice feeling. So any of the mirror matches, Frogtide, Oculus, really good into the Blink matchups, is really good into like Jeskai and Blue-White Control, kind of the same deal as the Blink decks, the Solitude decks, being able to warp out a Riddler early, replace itself, hard cast it late, replace itself, plus maybe draw an extra one. Turning it into like a 7 mana across 2 turns, draw 3, and have a 4/6 flying body is pretty significant. So really good into the Blue-White and the Jeskai control decks. And then any sort of mid-range deck that pops up, like if you run into decks like the Ritual decks, the Simic Ritual decks, if you run into any Jund Saga, anything like that, Quantum Riddler does a fantastic job of making sure you stay stable. Even against the opposing decks with Orcish Bowmaster, Quantum Riddler doesn't really care that much when you're just putting a 4/6 body into play and giving them a couple pings. You're still likely winning that range or winning that race, plus you've got a couple extra cards in hand. So really cool to see it there. Now that we've got the good out of the way, let's get into the bad a little bit. So hands down, the worst part about Quantum Riddler is unless you've got 5 mana sticking around, you're not going to be attacking with it. The warp obviously can be very effective. We'll talk about some cool lines with the card a little later. But you do have to invest the full 5 mana to have a threat in play that is attacking and actually getting the game over with. Now, I will say hard casting the Quantum Riddler does happen a lot more than you would expect it to. I feel like I see a good number of comments saying I'd never be able to cast a 5 mana sorcery speed creature. But when the rest of your deck is really built around allowing you to get to that point between subtlety and force negation, some other amount of counter magic, whether it be spell snare, stern scolding, counter spell, psychic frog, Thoughtseize, Tameo that your opponent's got to contend with, some normal interaction like your fatal push, shoot the sheriff, Shieldred's Edict package. You do have a lot of ways to prolong the game. And once you get to that later point and you're hard casting it, usually the draw 2 is enough to kind of stabilize your position, whether it is you need to find a removal spell, or if you've had a little extra filtering with a frog or a Kaito, you've probably got a force negation or a subtlety. So that tap out for Riddler isn't really a tap out. The other downside of the card is the warp can be a little awkward. If you know you're in a matchup where your opponent's not doing anything crazy, or you've just got a subtlety force negation to hold up anyway, then warping it early, replacing itself, isn't that big of a deal. But there can be times where you're up against, say, Boros energy. You need to be interacting. All you have is a warp. It feels pretty awful. That being said, if all you had was the Quantum Riddler warp, there's a reasonable chance you didn't have anything better to do with that turn anyway. But sometimes it can come up that you're on 3-4 mana, warp a Riddler. You could have hard cast an Oculus or hard cast a Murktide, been in a bit better of a position. The third thing is a 4/6 body for 5 mana is far from indestructible. It replacing itself is extremely nice, but the fact is the card still dies to like Unholy Heat, which I've had happen several times. So knowing your big grand payoff dies to a fairly common-ish removal spell is a bit of a tough pill to swallow. It can be awkward into the Grixis Reanimator decks with Oculus on their side because it's not eating an Oculus in combat and it's not attacking through an Oculus. And eventually they're going to swarm the board enough to kind of deal with what you've got going on. But if your Quantum Riddler sticking around and surviving, you're hoping you're going to be able to draw a way to get that Oculus off the battlefield and continue the pressure. Other than that, the worst matchups, it's okay into the combo decks. Unfortunately, the current builds with Riddler, the current really popular builds, really drop back some of the interaction that has previously made the combo matchups good. And even if you up that interaction, not having as consistent of a aggressively tempo costed threat as something like Murktide typically does, means you do have a rougher time into some of those matchups, actually getting the game over with. So that's some of the bad matchups. Let's go over some interesting lines that pop up a good bit. Okay, so I figure I'll go over like 4 or 5 lines or so that pop up a reasonably good amount of the time. I don't want to really harp on any lines that just never come up but once in a blue moon. I'm talking about things that you see fairly regularly that you either need to be aware of or need to have the idea about. First off is the Psychic Frog Quantum Riddler kind of tandem. This one probably comes up the most out of all the lines I'm going to go over. And this is just when you have a Psychic Frog on the battlefield and you've got a Quantum Riddler in hand and you're trying to think of what's the way to maximize Quantum Riddler. Sometimes you're going to warp, just draw a card. But if you have a bunch of dead stuff in hand, it's really nice to be able to warp the Quantum Riddler, discard a few extra cards to Frog, draw 2, go to combat, hit them, trigger on discard, draw 2 more. Just helps you to really filter through and like find some specific pieces of interaction. Some things to take note with this line. First off, if you can, I would wait until the Riddler resolves and the trigger for the ETB goes on the stack. You can hold priority to the trigger, discard to the Frog, and then draw off the Riddler. The reason is you don't want to like discard down to Riddler plus another card, cast the Riddler, and then have your opponent like subtlety the Riddler, and you don't get that trigger and you're down to 1 card in hand. Same thing with hitting them, trigger on the stack, discard. There can be some awkward points, like if you know you're up against a deck with Solitude, where you might not want to discard down to 1 to Frog, because the trigger is going to go on the stack. If you discard down to 1 and then attempt to resolve the trigger off the Riddler, the ETB, or the combat trigger off the Frog, and your opponent solitudes the Riddler, you only draw 1. You don't get to draw that extra card if the Riddler is no longer on the battlefield. So keep that in mind if you ever go for any of those lines. The second thing is Quantum Riddler. We don't have Quantum Riddler Ephemerate like Blink does, but what we do have is Quantum Riddler and Consigned to Memory. And thankfully, that line both comes up a decent bit and it comes up in matchups that we really want access to it. So, for example, against the Eldrazi decks or against the Zoo decks, two of the matchups that we're very likely to be bringing in a good number of Consigned to Memories. You can warp the Quantum Riddler for 2 and then consign the leave trigger for warp, because it'll create a delayed trigger, enters, draw your card, into your turn, creates a trigger to move the Quantum Riddler to exile. You can consign that trigger and keep your Quantum Riddler in play. And the fact that it comes up against Zoo that's got Scion of Dracos that can be a problem if you don't have a big flying threat to stand in front of them, or Eldrazi where you really need to speed up the clock is significant. Some other lines that come up a good bit, having a Quantum Riddler out on the board, going to your turn, your own upkeep with like 2 or 3 cards in hand, and you really want to draw the extra cards. Think about lines like Fatal Push your own Quantum Riddler, since you can't actually push it, but you can target it. Push goes to the yard, reduce your hand size by 1. You can also evoke a Subtlety with no target. So just 3 cards, Subtlety is one of them. Evoke a Subtlety, ditch something else, go down to 1, draw 2 off Riddler. Obviously, I only recommend this if you know that those cards you're discarding aren't going to be that effective, but it is a good line to have access to that a lot of people either are too scared to do or might not think about. I think a lot of times people don't want to throw away the stuff in their hand, but if the stuff in your hand isn't winning you the game or getting you closer to win the game, then just discarding it can be a lot more effective. Tameo in Riddler happens a lot. So one of my favorite lines that comes up a very good bit, and I already kind of hinted at it, is turn 2 Psychic Frog, like turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Psychic Frog, turn 3 Tameo from hand, land Tameo from hand, warp Riddler, discard down to 1 card, draw 2 off the Riddler, flip the Tameo, tick up Tameo, discard a card from hand or 2 cards, attack into the frog, draw 2 more. And now you've got a flip Tameo, you've got a big Psychic Frog, you're back up to 3 cards in hand, you got a Riddler going to warp. Can really do a good job of snowballing the game from that point. But you can also just have without the frog, like land Tameo, warp Riddler, flip Tameo in 1 turn, which has not been something that Dimir has really been able to consistently do before. You've seen some lines of like Tameo plus Flame of Anor, Tameo plus Archmage's Charm, which are fine. But Quantum Riddler getting to do the same thing for less mana and you get a body later is at least in my mind, a pretty big upgrade. Can also think about cards like Cling to Dust with Quantum Riddler. Being able to exile something, draw 2 is nice. Use up your mana like Force Negation, Flashback, do it again, draw 2 more. Can really stack up. And like saving clues for when you're down to 1 card in hand and able to crack a clue, draw 2 instead of crack a clue, draw 1 if you don't actually need the card right there, can really add up. I think that's about it for the interesting lines. Yeah, so let's get into some sideboarding and some game plans against a few of Modern's heavy hitters with the Dimir Riddler list. Okay, so there's not a great way to show some of these on screen, but if you're watching the video, you know the Modern metagame for the most part. You know a few of the matchups we're going to talk about and kind of have a better than good understanding of what to expect there. So let's start by getting that out of the way. Let's go through a couple sideboard options that have been really good for me against some of these popular decks. First off, we'll just go with like the stock list I've been running and the challenges and whatnot, which is this Esper list that you see on screen, and talk about some of the common cards that I'm sideboarding in and out. Obviously, if your list is a little bit different, you'll be able to make those adjustments, but just to give some of the big overarching differences that the Riddler list really brings to the table. So first off, Boros Energy we know is one of, if not the most popular deck in Modern at the moment. I do think the percentage has been coming down pretty significantly, not seeing it as much in challenges anymore, but it's still popular enough to need a solid plan into it. For me, having access to cards like Pest Control post board has made a world of difference. Now, it's never going to be as good as the Oculus builds, but being able to sweep away like those Guide of Souls, Ocelot Prides, Ragavans, Static Prisons, random tokens off of stuff like Ocelot Pride or Spyro has been really, really nice for letting me key in on like Flage is the thing to deal with. So I've been swapping or bringing in the Pest Controls, boarding out some Tamios. I think that the card is pretty bad in the Boros matchup to begin with, but when you're bringing in something that's blowing up all of your one drops, having a bunch of Tamio in the deck's not really the greatest to keep your plan in line. Ketchermos, really good into the Boros decks. Not only are they likely to be running some amount of Grave Hate, whether it be Thraben Charm or Ghost Vacuum or something like that, but being able to cling the dust on our side, Force Negation, Subtlety, exiling cards from hand, really easy to get Ketchermos online, and a lot of times it can help stall out the game until you're able to land a Quantum Riddler or some big threat to take over. Dreams of Stealing Oil comes in the matchup, usually to try to exile a Flage from the graveyard, but sometimes they're just casting it on one, trying to tempo out by taking like a Voice of Victory or a Spyro, some value-oriented threat, a Johnny, whatever the case may be. And then usually boarding out like a couple copies of Force Negation, or maybe on the draw a Counterspell and Force Negation, or a couple Thoughtseize if you think your opponent's going to be more aggressive for those few extra cards past the Pest Controls. Other than those, extra copies of like Stern Scolding are always good. Extra Spell Snares out of the sideboard, perfectly reasonable. If you're on an Oculus list and thinking of trying out Riddler, maybe you've got some Graveyard Trespassers laying around. Toxic Deluge in addition to Pest Control or Engineered Explosives can be really good, since they're not going to be killing your Quantum Riddlers or your Frogs or anything like that. Number 2, the Domain Zoo deck. So the new list, quite a bit heavier on like Flage, less so on, I think I've seen Tribal Flames be one of the big cuts recently. So Consigned to Memory is definitely coming in. It's really good for answering a Leyline or a Scion of Draco on the draw. Answers Leyline Binding ETB, can answer a Flage ETB, can answer a Ragavan or a Kavu attack or damage trigger. But most importantly, just Scion, Leyline Binding being like the two big things you want to be able to target. Depending on if I'm on the play or the draw, I could be 2 Consign on the play up to like the full 4 on the draw if I really want to bring in all my answers to Scion on turn 2. Harbinger of the Seas, really good bring in. You just have to be careful about Leyline into basics. Can get around Harbinger fairly well. So maybe keeping like 1 Harbinger in the board on the draw, bringing them both in on the play. Something like that's worked pretty well for me. And don't forget that you do have access to the Consigned Quantum Riddler play, which can be really, really good. Also, it can have the potential to get you down enough cards to be able to draw 2 on the next turn. Dreams of Stealing Oil definitely comes in against Zoo, hits all the creatures, exiles Flage from the yard. Ketchermos I usually bring in if my opponent shows me something past Leyline Binding, like say binding plus prismatic ending or chain to the rocks or something, I might not board in Ketchermos. A little more consistent or inconsistent against them than it is some of the other graveyard-centric decks. But Dreams definitely bringing in. The side outs, for me, I'm not a big Force Negation fan. The fact that they can Leyline Binding on your turn means that there's a chance Force Negation is going to be hard cast. If it's hard cast, it's terrible. So Force Negation usually gets a pretty aggressive trim from me. Stern Scolding, I wish was good, but unfortunately Ragavan and maybe Doorkeeper Thrall are like the only legal targets. So I'm usually down on Stern Scolding. Trim Tameo, Thoughtseize is a lot better on the draw than on the play. So being able to hit a Scion of Draco where Counterspell couldn't, but you do have access to Subtlety. So if you're like on 4 Subtlety, plus maybe a couple copies of Strategic Betrayal or Shieldred's Edict, you might be lower on Thoughtseize. And then I'll usually just board out like a Kaito or something on the draw. They're a pretty interactive deck. The chances of one of my threats getting to stick around, attack, enable ninjutsu is a little bit lower. So Kaito usually gets a trim from me. The third matchup, Amulet Titan. This is where Quantum Riddler really starts to suffer a little bit in my mind. Once you get to like Amulet Titan and Belcher, Storm, some of these combo decks, not having access to Murktide as a more efficient clock and more efficient threat is a very big deal. But against Amulet Titan, we typically have a fairly good matchup regardless of the 75 we register. So we've got Harbinger of the Seas coming in, Consigned to Memories for everything from Saga Search to their ability to make constructs, Amulet of Vigor, Titan ETB, Titan Attack Trigger, Dreams of Steel and Oils coming in, just an additional way to attack Titans. And as far as pest control goes, I don't mind boarding in pest control. Ideally, I would not, because Harbinger of the Seas being cast means pest control is getting locked out, but you can cycle it. So it's not the biggest downside if you do decide to keep them in. And they can very much save you from Saga tokens or your opponent just racking up a bunch of amulets, whatever the case may be. So sideboarding out, I usually cut a few copies of Fatal Push. Might be the full 4, but at least like 3. I'll keep Shoot the Sheriff, Strategic Betrayal, Shieldred's Edict, because they're good ways to answer a Titan. Stern Scolding's coming out. Spell Snare's coming out. Force Negation's usually getting pretty trimmed. And you're just trying to like get some way to pressure down early, whether that be a Frog on 2 or Harbinger on 3, Kaito on 4, hard cast a Subtlety on 4, whatever the case may be, just some way to get the pressure going, and then utilize Subtlety Counterspell to keep them off of Titan, and then hopefully if you can find a Harbinger in the meantime, that's a pretty good way to lock them out. Grixis Reanimator. Ooh, Reanimator's been a weird one. So I put 2 Rest in Peace in the sideboard initially because Reanimator, one, like, can't get the card off the board, period. Rest in Peace comes down. They just become a very, very bad one-dimensional deck with bad counter spells, Emperor of Bone beats, and Frog beats, and that's all they got going for them. So getting down Rest in Peace can often just be lights out against them. Obviously, it's for any graveyard-centric deck. So think of Storm, think of Reanimator, think of Goryo's Vengeance, Dredge, whatever the case may be. But I definitely think the Grixis Reanimator and Goryo's are like the 2 most popular decks for Rest in Peace at the moment. So Rest in Peace definitely coming in. Dreams of Steel and Oil definitely coming in. Mystical Dispute can come in because it does counter a Frog on the draw or just a hard cast Oculus. It can also fight over like a Spell Pierce or something for them trying to protect a Persist or an Unearth. Ketchermos can come in pretty good at once it sticks, they can't really get it off the board. And anytime a threat is able to do that and potentially gain a little bit of card advantage, I'm a big fan of it. Most of my board outs, I'll usually like trim on Preordain. I kind of need interaction now, not later. Subtlety is a little bit mid. Quantum Riddler can be a little bit slow. Kaito is really good, but if you are against a very interactive variation of Grixis or Gorios, that can be kind of awkward. Force Negation, unfortunately, I think is a necessity. I don't like Force into Thoughtseize matchups, but you kind of have to have access to it in some of those unfair starts. You don't want your opponent to go end of your turn one, fetch up a Surveil, flip over like an Archon, untap, persist it, and you not have a way to deal with that. So if you're heavier on like Spell Snares, then you can cut some Forces. But if you're not heavier on Spell Snare, I would definitely keep the Forces in. Belcher is another one where Quantum Riddler kind of hurts because you don't have the ability to get out a quick clock as consistently. You notice that's a bit of a running theme here with Riddler. But board ends, Mystical Dispute, fantastic. Fights over literally everything in their deck outside of hardcast a Belcher. But if they're paying 4 mana for a Belcher, I'm fine paying 3 for a bad mana leak. 4 copies of Consigned Memory definitely coming in. Dreams of Steel and Oil can come in. It's a lot better on the play, exponentially better on the play than on the draw, because turn 1 Dreams can hit a Lotus before they suspend it, but Dreams on the draw can miss Lotus. But there's still going to be games where you can like exile a Belcher from hand. So you're definitely bringing it in if you have access to it. Rest in Peace is a little bit of a dicey one. So Rest in Peace does shut down Tameshi, which is a surprisingly big deal. That being said, the Belcher deck does have access to Sink into Stupor. They've got Into the Flood Malls. They got plenty of ways to like bounce Rest in Peace if they need to. But if you find yourself with room and need a couple extra sideboard spots or sideboard cards to bring in, Rest in Peace could be the answer. The cuts against Belcher, usually Shoot and Strategic Betrayal are out pretty easy. You can trim like Fatal Push or 2, depending on if they're playing Flare of Denial. If they're not playing Flare of Denial, then Fatal Push doesn't matter so much. But if they are playing Flare, then you need to be able to somewhat keep those threats off the board. So I would just kind of keep an eye on, especially if it's open deck list, whether or not they're on Flare. Cameo's great. Cling to Dusk, you can shave. Cling to Dust, you can shave if you want. The subtleties are fairly mid. Kaito, Quantum Riddler, both can be like a little bit slow, but you need to keep up your pressure. So I would keep Kaito in before Quantum Riddler, but either of them could be trimmed pretty easily. As for mid-range, so we'll just take this as being like the Blink decks. I don't know if this actually is the Blink decks. It's like us. Yeah, it's literally just like Riddler decks. So let's talk about Blink instead. Against Blink, couple copies of Consign are okay if they're a heavy Flicker Wisp Felia build. If they're not heavy on Flicker Wisp or Felia, like if they're Esper Control, then I wouldn't bring in Consign at all. It's not good enough if all it's doing is stifling an ETB trigger. It is good enough if it's exiling something and leaving it in exile. So good for that. Dreams of Steel and Oil is excellent. Ketchermos is excellent. The heavier they go on blue. So if my opponent is only on 4 Quantum Riddler, I'm not bringing in Mystical Dispute. If they're on Riddler and Frog, I probably am. If they're past that, like Esper Control with Counterspell, Riddler, Frog to Fairy, then I'm definitely bringing in Mystical Dispute. But as soon as I get up to like 6 to 8 blue cards or more, that's kind of where I start bringing in Mystical Dispute. The stuff that I'm boarding out, Force Negation is pretty much the easiest cut there is. If they're on the more control heavy build, then instead of force negation, you could trim fatal pushes, like 3 push instead of 3 force for 2 mystical dispute and a dreams, or 2 mystical dispute dreams catcher modes for like 3 force negation and something counter spell if they're on straight blink. Eldrazi, we'll talk 2 more matchups. Eldrazi, another one that's definitely down a bit with Quantum Riddler instead of Murktide. So you still have access to your Harbingers and your Consigned to Memories, but the big deal is not being able to have a high power, highly tempo positive threat. So being able to play out a Murktide is like a 6/6 on turn 3 after a Thoughtseize, or while holding up Consign is a really big deal. Don't really have access to that in this list. So you're trying to be more aggressive about finding a frog early if you can, or even like Tamiyo, Ninjutsu, a Kaito, but something to start hitting your opponent pretty solidly. So Consign, obviously the auto bring in. Harbinger of the Seas, excellent to bring in. Dreams of Steel and Oil usually gets the nod from me because worst case scenario, if you cast it early, you might hit like a Talisman to slow him down. You could hit a Sowing Myco spawn. You could hit a Devourer of Destiny, a Glaring Fleshraker. I think Glaring Fleshraker is the card I lose to out of any Eldrazi build more than anything else. So anytime I have a card that can take that out while also having some other targets, it's a pretty big deal. Things that I'm looking at cutting, Spell Snare, Stern Scoldings can get cut pretty easily. Some number of Subtlety can get cut pretty easy. It's really good if they're heavy on like Karn the Great Creator. It's really bad if they're heavy on Sowing Myco spawns and Ugin and Devourer of Destiny and stuff like that. So just take it with a grain of salt which one you're bringing in. Fatal pushes usually get trimmed pretty aggressively. Like I might board out all 4 if I don't think there's a chance they're on Fleshraker. I might keep in a couple if I think they're on Fleshraker and something else I can target. Ideally, I would get to consign something like Fleshraker instead, but it doesn't always work out that way, especially when you need to be getting your threat down as soon as possible. Like if you play out a turn 2 frog, pass, and your opponent plays Eldrazi Temple Fleshraker, you don't want to be sitting there with just a bunch of consigns in hand and not be able to deal with that. So that's Eldrazi. And then last, let's go Affinity. Affinity's popping up a good bit. Thankfully, the Affinity deck doesn't seem to be putting up the results or showing the amount of popularity that I was afraid it would. And I think that's in large part to Wrath the Skies. So Pest Control, definitely the best card we have against Affinity by a mile. Being able to wipe away all the drone tokens, Memnites, Ornithopter, Springleaf Drum, Lava Spur Boots, Mox Opal, any of that stuff. We've got Mystical Disputes coming out of the board for Emery, Thought Monitor, Kappa Cannoneer, Metallic Rebuke. And then Dreams of Steel and Oil definitely comes in. Hit Thought Monitor, Kappa Cannoneer. Consigned to Memory. I think Consigned to Memory is a little bit of a trap. I think it's a lot better on the play than the draw. So if you are going to bring it in, I would bring it in on the play, not on the draw. But a lot of times the best use you're getting out of it is you're having to decide on something like a Mox Opal turn 1. If they've got the Mox Opal, you're probably firing off the Consign. Otherwise, you're hoping to like stifle the chapter 2 on an Urza's Saga. But if you don't use the Consign on turn 1 and they don't have the Urza's Saga, you just wasted your entire Consign. And I don't really like cards that leave it up to a gamble as to whether or not it's going to get a useful effect out of you. So Mystical Dispute, Pest Control, Dreams of Steel and Oil are like the 6 I'm really high on. Consign a little bit lower. Stuff I'm boarding out against Affinity. Kaito's getting the cut pretty aggressively. It just doesn't attack through much of anything between the Saga tokens, Ornithopter, Thought Monitor, Kappa, Memnite, all that. So Kaito gets cut pretty aggressively. Tamio gets cut pretty aggressively because we're bringing in pest controls. And then Spell Snare is usually the other cut. So like 3 Tamio, 2 Kaito, Spell Snare for 3 pest control, 2 Mystical Dispute Dreams. I usually don't like cutting all of the Kaito, all of the Tamio, because you'll have those random games where you just have like a Tamio on 1, your opponent doesn't do anything. Turn 2, double preordain, flip it. They go for an Emissary on 2, you subtlety it, and now all of a sudden you have a very real threat of a Tamio ult. But if I don't have that line, I don't want to draw into Tamio turn 3, 4, 5, whatever. So I really want it to be like, this is my one of in the opening hand, or I just never see it. But that's it for some of the matchups, some of the popular things we get into. Let's go over some different builds we're testing out of the Riddler list, and maybe give you some ideas to try out at your next F&M or local modern event. All right, so first and foremost, the Esper list. I think this is the one that I have played the most of. Top 8'd, couple challenges with it, done pretty consistently. I like the overall build. The 2 big reasons being, this is like the first time I've played a blue-black X deck in Modern and felt like Rest in Peace was the right choice for Grave Hate. So in the main, outside of Jumping Frog, we have no grave dependency whatsoever. Kaito doesn't care. Quantum Riddler, Subtlety, Force. Tamio can buy back stuff, but just Tamio like flipping, making a couple clues is perfectly reasonable as well, or threatening ult. But Rest in Peace, being able to just completely shut down the graveyard in any sort of unfair graveyard deck is a big deal. Pest Control is the second reason to go white. It's a really good cleanup option into Affinity, into Boros, into random like Asmarano, Mordekaiser, Kuldakar decks, stuff like that. We'll see Dimir running alternatives, but Pest Control is kind of like, in my opinion, the best of the best, because it gives you the ability to hit all those cheap artifacts and cheap things out of Boros, while also just cycling if you don't end up needing it. So it's that versatility, really aggressively costed, very light splash that I think makes it a solid option. We've had a lot of people ask about Wrath the Skies. I have tried it, but the mana is not very friendly. You're a deck that obviously wants a lot of blue pips available very often, very early. So with Wrath the Skies, you're wanting to get like Meticulous Archive, Hallowed Fountain, but then all of these Thought Seizes and Fatal Pushes and Shoot the Sheriffs and Kaitos get exponentially worse. So you're effectively hurting your main deck mana for a sideboard card. Now, there might be an argument you can make for setting the list up to like fetch out or have like a Watery Grave in the main that gets swapped out for an extra Hallowed Fountain post board or something. I haven't tried that. Could be an idea for someone to test. But personally, I just don't like the idea of putting a land in my sideboard or messing up, again, my game 1 mana for a sideboard card that I'm not even guaranteed to draw. Petramos, really, really good into anything that's bringing in Grave Hate. Not that we necessarily need it with Quantum Riddler, but a really good value threat. Help keep cards rolling with stuff like Psychic Frog, Cling to Dust, Strategic Betrayal, Dreams of Steel and Oil, all triggering Petramos. You can run Prismatic Ending. We've run Teferi Time Reveler I've been really, really impressed with when I've run Teferi. I think it's extremely good into decks like, it's good into Zoo. It's good into any of these like Esper, blue-white control decks. It's really good into Gorios. It's really good into the Mirror. It's good into Blink. So Teferi is definitely an option you could go with. There are straight Dimir lists that have done very well. Mostly just swapping out stuff in the sideboard like Pest Control for cards like Engineered Explosives. We've seen Dress Down show up a good bit. Going up on some post-board counters like extra copies of Stern Scolding or Spell Snare. We have seen Toxic Deluge as a very popular option. Pretty much just replacing like the Wrath effects with some options that are a little less consistent or a little less all-encompassing. Orcish Bowmaster, really popular. Obviously, you can play that in any build that you want, but most of the time when I'm splashing for white, I don't feel the need so much for Bowmaster because of Pest Control coming in. And then one of the recent ones that I'll mention because it got my attention, I've been looking at trying it out, is Grixis. So going Grixis for Ragavan in the main, as opposed to something like Orcish Bowmaster, just giving you a little more ability to Ragavan into Kaito on turn 2, treasures helping you hard cast Quantum Riddler, but really just that mana advantage, like letting you double spell or triple spell a lot faster than Dimir or Esper has access to. Meltdown and Pyroclasm being like the premier things to do out of the sideboard. Meltdown for the stuff like Affinity, Pyroclasm for decks like Boros. You see how normally in Esper you'd have access to Pest Control. Unfortunately, Red kind of has to separate that into multiple categories unless you're running cards like Brotherhood's End. Now, I've seen people talking about Fire Magic. I'm really not a Fire Magic fan. I think that there's going to be a lot of games against Boros or against other creature-based decks where 2 toughness is a necessity. So having to pay 3 mana for Fire Magic instead of 2 for Pyroclasm is a big deal. I don't think the amount of times that you can get away with only paying 1 and killing what you need to kill is enough to outweigh missing those 2 drops without having to pay 3. So I'm a big proponent of Pyroclasm instead of Fire Magic, but I have seen people testing out Fire Magic and saying it's been good for them. Some other red cards you could consider: Kolaghan's Command, Flame of Anor are reasonable-ish. I'm not hugely sold on any of those. I think that those plans, for the most part, just kind of bog you down a little bit. They're just like expensive, kind of clunky-ish removal spells. Cards like Lightning Bolt are reasonable. Expressive Iteration is okay, but I don't think you want Expressive Iteration in your deck full of like Kaito, Quantum Riddler, reactive free spells. So I don't think Iteration is going to get a whole lot of mileage for you. The last option is Sultai. I have not seen a good Sultai list. And the big part of that to me is Sultai doesn't really have anything that it's adding that adds a significant amount of value. With Esper and with Rakdos, or Esper and Grixis, you get access to really, really efficient sweeper options. But a lot of the ones that Sultai gives you access to are like 4 mana, like Culling Ritual, and just a little bit too clunky. Tarmogoyf isn't really where the deck wants to be when you're really not focusing on 1-for-1 interaction. You're trying to 2-for-1 a little more consistently. Grist, it's kind of the same thing. You're not really sacking anybody off. So you need Grist to stick around for like multiple turns to really get an effect. Abrupt Decay could be interesting. But Abrupt Decay in a world full of like Scion of Dracos and Leyline Bindings, opposing Quantum Riddlers, Overlords, Solitudes, I just think has a high chance of not getting to tag enough stuff especially if you put it alongside Fatal Push that's already missing some of that. So that's about all I got for the matchups. I believe that's kind of like the whole video. Yeah, so I guess we'll just call it there. As always, appreciate y'all sitting around, listening to me ramble on a little bit. If you've got questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. Or if you want to come join the Discord, like I said, link down in the description. Love to have you over there, talk anything that you've got going on. We'll be ramping up testing pretty aggressively for the RCs. If you're going to like RC Houston, let me know so you can say hey. I'd love to meet anybody that's hanging around watching the videos. Other than that, links down below for the Twitter where we do monthly Playpoint giveaways, Blue Sky, the Twitch channel if you want to come check out a live stream. And yeah, hope you all have a fantastic rest of your evening. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.